welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this final session of the speaker series entitled Making Our Way to a Good Death. This 5-part series hosted by LifePath and the Community Hospice in partnership with the Albany Guardian Society has been an exciting endeavor and aimed to help us better understand our emotions as part of life and love. Felicia Segelkin of LifePath and myself, Kristen Vivian of the Community Hospice, are your moderators, and we are glad that you have joined us today. A couple of housekeeping items. Please remain muted, as Felicia has said, with your camera in the off function engaged so that we can avoid distraction and preserve connectivity. We invite you to use the chat box for any questions that may come up throughout the presentation. You can engage your chat box simply by moving your cursor along the bottom of your screen, looking for the little chat box and clicking on that, and then typing a message sent to everyone in the group, and we will be happy to read those, and if they are appropriate during the conversation, we will pose those to the presenter. There will be time as well at the end for the panel to respond to additional questions. The slides to this presentation will be shared after the session, and this is being recorded, and so you will be able to find this along with the other presentations posted on the LifePath website so that you can listen again and you can share with others. The series was designed to take us on a journey, arriving here today in session 5. So if you weren't able to attend previous sessions, as I mentioned, you are encouraged to visit the LifePath website and enjoy those presentations as well. I'm going to go ahead and turn the mic over to Felicia to introduce our speakers. Thank you again for joining us as we conclude the series this afternoon.
Thank you, Kristen. So our first speaker that I'd like to introduce you all to today is Carla Safka, who is a professor of social work at Siena College. Carla has clinical experience with medical, psychiatric, and hospice social work, and has also served as a member of the bereavement support team. Carla has conducted trainings on death, loss, and grief for professionals and volunteers for local organizations, as well as done continuing education workshops and webinars. Carla has co-edited the book Dying, Death, and Grief in an Online Universe about the use of the internet as a resource for death education and coping with loss. Carla has graciously agreed to join us again for another session, and so we are thankful for her for that today. Our second speaker is Dr. Carol Curran, who has been a community hospice medical director since 2019. Dr. Curran has received her medical degree from Albany Medical College and postgraduate training in pediatrics and emergency medicine at Albany Medical Hospital. Dr. Curran has practiced emergency medicine for 17 years before embarking on a master's degree in palliative care and a fellowship in palliative medicine. Dr. Curran is a Vital Talk instructor, providing training in essential communication skills for conversations about serious illness to hospice and other medical staff. And last but certainly not least is Robin Bortle. Started her career in natural health, focusing on massage therapy practice for those with complex medical issues. In 2012, Robin had returned to SUNY Adirondack for her nursing degree and gained experience as an oncology nurse. In 2014, Robin found her way to the community hospice, nursing and supporting patients and families. She continues to pursue advanced degrees, completing a master's in nursing leadership. Robin currently holds the role of quality, education, and infection control manager for the community hospice and is working on her doctorate in nursing practice, which she plans to complete next year. And with that, I will pass it off to our speakers.
Okay, well, welcome today to this conversation that certainly is a little unusual. It's not necessarily comfortable for people to talk about death on a daily basis, so I applaud your comfort coming today and your eagerness to learn more about this. So we certainly hope that you will join in the conversation as the presentation goes on in the chat box as you were instructed before. And Felicia and Kristen are going to help us to make good decisions about whether we handle those questions when they come up in the chat box or if they're more appropriate to wait for later. The first thing we thought we would ask you to do is to teach us a little bit about how familiar you are with some of the topics that are going to be presented today. So our moderators are going to launch a poll. Hopefully you've participated in a Zoom poll before, but the questions will pop up on your screen. And as you click on a response, it'll allow you to move to the next question. So we're going to take a few minutes for you to answer several questions that we will use the responses to as we go along.
And
just bear with me, Felicia, bear with me 1 second. I just need to get the co-host back. I can't.
Okay, let me see if
Can you start it, Carla?
That's what I was trying to do, but actually my screen just shifted and now all I see are all the participants' thumbnails. Okay, are you seeing a poll on your screen? I'm going to hit the launch button. Are you all seeing the poll? Okay, good. It looks like people can see it. So if you could just take a few minutes and answer the questions, that would be great. So the first question we're going to ask you to think about is, have you ever thought about what a good death looks like to you? All right. So it looks like it's working. I'm starting to see the responses popping up. So looks like 4 people have successfully been able to answer it. If you're having any challenges, maybe you can let us know in the chat box, and if we need to answer questions about how to do this, we can. Okay, looks like more of you now are responding. Okay. So at this point, we don't have anybody who doesn't know what that concept means, which is interesting because I won't need to define it as much. And it looks like we've got everyone so far who's responded has thought about this at least a little bit. Oops, we got somebody who hasn't thought about it much, which is okay, because maybe this is the door to helping you start to do that. Okay. And what you can also do, I see some people are already starting to respond to the other questions, so I'm going to scroll down and take a look at those responses. The second question is, how familiar are you with tools that are available to help with advanced care planning or formalizing advanced directives? Looks like a couple people aren't familiar with those, and we're gonna talk about a resource that you can use after this presentation to help with that. Some of you are somewhat familiar and some of you are very familiar, perhaps because you participated in the 3rd presentation in this series, which educated people about advanced care planning. The 3rd question we'd like you to think about is, have you communicated your wishes about end-of-life care with someone else? And it looks like 82%, wow, that's impressive. 82% of the people in this audience have had those conversations, which is wonderful. And some of you haven't, but again, maybe participating in this series is what will precipitate your comfort level and your ability to do that. The 4th question we've asked people to think about is, have any of your loved ones shared their wishes about end-of-life care with you? And that's also a really impressive statistic that 95% of the people who've responded have had someone put their trust in you to understand what those wishes are, which is great. And then the fifth question that we've asked you to think about is how familiar are you with hospice? One person isn't familiar at all, so hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll have some really helpful information about that. Some of you are somewhat familiar, about 43%, and about 52% are very familiar with hospice. So that's encouraging to know that for some of you, you're already familiar with and perhaps comfortable thinking about the use of hospice care or have experience with that. All right, so thank you for sharing your thoughts and opinions and experiences. I'm actually going to hit the share results button just so you can very quickly see what I saw on my screen. So there we have familiarity with the concept. And have you ever thought about what a good death looks like to you? So about half of the audience has thought about it a lot, and about half not so much or not at all. How familiar are you with the tools? Those statistics didn't change much since I mentioned them before. About 61% are somewhat familiar and 30% are very familiar. Communicating your wishes about end-of-life care, 83% have done that and 17% have not. And 91% have been the recipient of that information from someone who you care about. And familiarity with hospice ranges from somewhat familiar largely to very familiar. And hopefully the person who isn't familiar will change that answer by the time we're finished today. All right. So what we're going to do first, and Felicia, if you can, let's see, I just got to clear the poll off my screen. We're going to talk a little bit about what the concept of a good death means. All right. And so on the next slide, what you'll see is a definition that was constructed by the Institute of Medicine. They published a report in 1997 that defined a good death as one that is, quote, free from avoidable distress and suffering for the patient, the family, and caregivers in general accord with the patient's and family's wishes, and reasonably consistent with clinical, cultural, and ethical standards. So what that says to me is that it's really important to think about the process of that death and how it impacts not only the patient, but the people in their life who they care about, whether that's family or friends, and the people who are involved in their care. And it's also important to think about clinical standards, how the medical system defines care at the end of life, what's appropriate and accessible and acceptable and normal within the culture in which a person lives, but also thinking about ethical issues, because sometimes it's very difficult to come to agreement across all of these different parties who are involved in end-of-life care. So we're going to take a look at the next slide. And what we're going to do is we're going to ask you to tell us what your thoughts are about what you think the characteristics of a good death look like. So if you have imagined the end of life and what that would look like for you, if it happened in the best possible way, because I think hospice care providers would say that hospice, their goal and mission is to help achieve a good death. So we want you to share what you think the characteristics of that good death might look like at the end of your own life. So we're going to encourage you to use the chat box, type your thoughts in there and share them with everyone. And I will try to summarize them to the best of my ability as they scroll by the screen. Okay, so somebody says no surprises. In other words, they want to know and understand what that process might look like for them. Excellent. Thanks for sharing that. Being pain-free, but still able to communicate with loved ones is able. That balance is really important. Having your loved ones present. Again, addressing that pain, minimal pain, and immediate family close by. There's that pain again. That's a very common theme. And having the people you love close by. Having time to say goodbye. Having people respect your wishes, also very, very important. So I'll wait a little bit longer to see if anybody else wants to share their thoughts. Okay, being at home with family and friends close by, saying goodbye and sharing. Okay, not feeling like a burden, also very common. Peaceful passing with family and children present. Okay, so thanks so much to everyone for sharing. All right, again, peaceful, calm, fading away, financially able to cover expenses. Also an important theme for many people. All right, so what I'm going to do now is ask Felicia to advance the slide, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a study that was published. Back in 2016, a physician named Emily Meyer and a set of her colleagues published a study that described 11 core themes of a good death. What they did was they scoured the published literature, and they found about 36 studies that had described in some way, shape, or form what the researchers learned from patients who were dealing with their impending death, from their family members and friends either before the death occurred, or sometimes they interviewed them after the death of a loved one. And also they interviewed healthcare providers to teach them how they would describe the traits and characteristics of a good death. And so they published this study that identified 11 themes of what they learned from all of these stakeholders in the dying process. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to summarize what they published in their study, and we'll see how they compare with what you described for us in the chat box. So on the next slide, you're going to see the first set of themes that they described. So one of the things that were contained in those characteristics of a good death or successful dying was how well the preferences for that patient's dying process. In other words, what were their thoughts about where it would happen, who they wanted to be present. And I saw those in the chat box. Someone said they wanted to die at home, which addresses the where. For some people, they may have a preference to actually pass away in a hospital. And maybe that's because they're concerned about the ability of their family to provide that care, not wanting to be a burden in relation to their physical care. Those things are all related to their preferences for how that dying process occurs. The other yellow box is so important because sometimes in my experience as a hospice social worker, the patients and sometimes the families had different ideas or thoughts about whether or not they were comfortable being present when their loved one passed away. And I know sometimes, and I believe this was the case when my mother died, I think she made the choice to pass away when my father and I weren't there. We left her room for a very short period of time and got a call from my cousin saying, you need to get back here quickly, because she was a nurse and she knew based on what she was seeing that the time was close. And my mother passed away before we got back. So, and I'm sure my colleagues can tell stories about this, but one of the things that we'll probably talk about a lot during this presentation is that not everybody's thoughts or wishes about a good death are going to match the ones of the people in their life. And I think hospice is a great resource to help have conversations about those things. Is there anything, Robin or Carol, that you would want to add about that bullet for preferences for the dying process?
No, I loved how you added the story of, you walked out of the room and then things shifted with your loved one. It's not uncommon. I've seen that happen quite a bit. It's not always what we expect, I think, where we think we're going to be at the bedside and it doesn't always work out that way, but certainly the time spent previous or leading up to that is just as precious as being there when the person passes.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And I also appreciated the fact that you did point out that some people don't want to die at home. And that underscores the importance of knowing what people's goals of care are. For a patient who, for whatever reason, says, I don't care, what you have to do to me to keep my heart beating. I want my heart to beat as long as it possibly can. that may mean that they will pass in a hospital, but that's okay because that's what they asked you to do for them.
Right.
So,
And having those conversations when someone is in a position to do it is so important, because that provides your hospice care team with the advice and direction that they need to honor people's wishes. The other thing on this slide that's equally important to talk about is making sure that a patient's wishes about treatment are understood. And I know Dr. Curran's going to talk a little bit more about this at some point in the presentation. And having that sense of power and control over the decisions and the choices that are made about your care is very important to most people. So again, I'll ask if there's anything that Dr. Curran or Robin that you want to add about those last two boxes.
no, I don't think so. Thank you, though.
Okay. On the next slide are some additional traits and characteristics of what the people in these studies described as characteristics of a good death. We saw this in the chat box so many times that people, it's important to be pain-free if possible. And I so appreciated the person who talked about also the alertness, because one of the things that your medical team will have to talk with you about and deal with very carefully is how to balance making sure that your pain is controlled, but also if it's important to be alert and conscious, sometimes pain medications can compromise people's ability to even stay awake. So that's a really important conversation to have early in the process to make sure that your wishes are understood. Now, the third point on this slide about quality of life, a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today are very subjective. And so finding out how someone defines what makes a life meaningful, what makes a life purposeful, and how you balance quality of life with the length of time that someone has during a terminal illness is a really important conversation to have. Part of that for many people is being able to be hopeful. And hope is a fascinating thing. We could talk for an hour just about what hope means, because it can be defined in many, many different ways. And for some people, hope means finding a cure for an illness. But once that is no longer possible, hope can take so many forms about what they want the last part of their life to look like. And being able to find joy and pleasure in the time that they have left was important to many people who described that in these studies. And I think that just dovetails with the last point, that the life that they have left to live is worth living. So I'll pause at this point and see if Robin or Dr. Curran want to add anything to this slide. Okay, it looks like we can go to the next slide. Another set of traits and characteristics of successful dying were defined as being prepared for the end of their life. And for many people, this meant having the opportunity to express their wishes about what they wanted that care to look like. The third presentation in the series that happened a few weeks ago and is available on the website as a recording, the goal of that presentation was to do just that, to educate people about what an advanced directive or an advanced care plan is and the different formats that those can take. So if you're one of the people that expressed in the poll that you're not very familiar with this, I would strongly encourage you, if you didn't already participate in that presentation, to watch it, because it is just jam-packed with very practical information about what an advanced directive is. They talk about living wills, they talk about healthcare proxies, they talk about MOLS or medical orders for life-sustaining treatment and how those are enacted within the healthcare system. And there are tons and tons of links to web-based resources that not only help you learn about what these are, give you access to the forms that are used, but also give you access to tools to help you have conversations with family and friends, as well as your physicians, about what your wishes are, and to have those people help you document them. So I think that is an incredibly valuable resource no matter how much you know already about it, if somebody ever asks you, where do I go to learn about these things? Where do I go to make plans for these? There are wonderful resources contained in that presentation. The other thing that people talked about in terms of preparation for death was having conversations about what happens after you pass away. So are there tools out there to help you think about decisions that need to be made for your funeral? I teach a death and dying class at Siena, and I always take my students to the funeral home as a field trip because I want them to go at a time when there isn't an imminent need to learn about the 80+ decisions that need to be made after someone passes away to plan for their funeral. And so there are a lot of online resources that can educate you about these and provide you tools to document your wishes. So the website address that I put up there is one of those sites, the everplans.com. They have, I don't know, 10 or 12 different sections of the website that help you think about different aspects of planning. There are also other websites that are out there to do that. The National Funeral Directors Association also has great resources as well. So preparing for death can involve preparations related to your medical and health care at the end of life, but also planning for what happens after your death. Another component of a good death that people talked about was how important it is to feel that they're being treated with dignity and respect. And that can mean a lot of different things to different people. But one of the things that I always loved about my role in hospice care is that we gave people a chance to tell us what that meant to them. And it can mean a lot of different things to different people. A big part of that for many people is to maintain someone's independence for as long as that is possible. And independence can also take many different forms. It doesn't necessarily mean being able to live on your own. It means having control over tasks and activities of daily living, or even just being able to communicate your wishes for as long as possible. And is there anything, Robin or Dr. Curran, that you want to add to that particular point? Because I think your experience in your roles is really important to draw on here.
I actually think you're doing a great job, Carla. I don't really have a lot to add there.
Okay. Anything you want to add, Robin?
No, I think I'll further emphasize this when we get to the members of the care team.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
great. All right, and in terms of emotional well-being, this is another very broad phrase that can capture all kinds of elements of someone's experience, not only if they're the patient who's dying, but their friends and family and caregivers who are involved in this process. And emotional support just means that someone feels that they have someone that they can talk to express what they're thinking and feeling, and also someone to be there so that they're not alone. So often when people have described for me their definition of a good death, it's not being alone. And alone can happen on many levels. It might be a physical presence of just having someone there to hold your hand, to know you're not in that room by yourself. But it also means that you're not emotionally alone. Now, psychological comfort is an interesting concept because that can mean the absence of emotional pain, but it can also mean having a good handle on what you do to cope with the stress that is a part of this process. So a lot of what members of the hospice team also provide, I think, is guidance and assistance in helping people to recognize and identify what those coping strategies and strengths are that they already have and to help them draw on them, but perhaps to provide additional guidance and support to identify new coping strategies if they feel they need some support in that respect. Another theme that came up in the findings from all of these studies was kind of a sense of feeling that your life was completed to the degree that you needed that to happen. This came up in the chat box as well. I saw at least one person say having the opportunity and the time to say goodbye was important. The other part of life completion, that can be defined as feeling that you've accomplished your goals and that you've done that in a way that you're proud of and comfortable with. For some people, this can mean making amends. This can mean taking care of, I think I've heard the term many times, unfinished business. And that having the opportunity to accomplish those things can sometimes lead to the sense that you're ready and prepared for your death to occur, or what sometimes people call acceptance. If you're familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work, of course, you're going to recognize that the fifth component of coping with impending death was acceptance. And I think that's being comfortable that you've done everything that you can to prepare for your death, and perhaps to prepare others for your death. Is there anything that you would like to add, Robin or Dr. Curran, to that particular half of the slide? Okay. Now, oh, I see.
Oh, sorry.
Dr. Curran.
I was going to add too, and that's something that our team helps to facilitate is saying goodbye and helping to process during that time as well through the interdisciplinary team.
Okay, Dr. Curran, was there anything you wanted to add?
No, I was just going to say, I think that we're a good team, because I think what Robin has to say subsequently and what I have to say subsequently will sort of, give more information about each of these things and kind of round them out.
Okay, so maybe what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and finish the themes, and I'll trust that you'll add those things when they come up. Okay. Now, one of the things you're going to learn as well is that part of the hospice team is pastoral care and chaplaincy, and they largely help take care of this next theme that came up. For many people, religion and spirituality are also very subjective. For some people, that's a formal affiliation with the church or a particular religious belief system. For some people, spirituality is less formal and is more of what makes life meaningful and full of purpose. And I think religion can complement that, but some people will say they experience spirituality and define it without formal religion. So that's always a fascinating part of learning someone's story, is understanding how that is defined. And so people described components of a good death as including achieving a sense of comfort with their spirituality, drawing on their faith to help them cope with the end of their life and the process that leads to their death, and also having the opportunity to meet with someone formally if that's relevant to their faith and their beliefs. So on the next slide, we'll identify a couple more themes that came up in the research. Of course, family is a huge part of this process. And I want to just make sure that my definition of family includes family of choice. And sometimes friends are considered family. So I define that very, very broadly, as I think hospice recognizes that as well. So thinking about having support from the people they care about. And this is where that theme of acceptance of death comes back, because it's not just the patient who has to find a path towards that. It's the people who care about that patient as well. And being prepared for death, it's interesting, and we can talk about this more when we have our discussion, is that the word preparation means many things to different people. And I remember having some people almost get angry at me if I used that word, because they're like, how could I ever be prepared for this? And then I've had other people use it very openly. So that's also very, very subjective. So what does it take for someone to feel more prepared for that to happen? That's an important part of the conversation. And so many of you talked about not being a burden in the chat box. This is probably one of the most common things that I heard in my role as a hospice social worker, that the patient didn't want to be a burden to their family. On the next slide, we have some more information about components of a good death. I mentioned earlier in the slide about the definition of a good death, they talked about cultural aspects of this process. It's so important to be aware of someone's cultural affiliations and their background and how that culture influences their beliefs about illness, their beliefs about medical care and treatment, their beliefs about what's important during the dying process. Sometimes that culture almost dictates where a death is supposed to occur or who's supposed to be providing that care. And sometimes it's very challenging when reality and the circumstances of a patient's illness and impending death might not match up very well with what they value and what's important. And I think hospice does a great job helping people to navigate those kinds of challenges. And other things that came up, and these really didn't fall in other categories, although I would argue that pets are people too. So I consider pets to be family. And a lot of people, it was very important for them to be able to be with their pets. I remember when a dear friend of mine died at a local hospice program in Albany, and this was over 15 years ago, she wanted to say goodbye to her pets. And her pets were not traditional pets. It wasn't a dog or a cat, but hospice let them come in anyway. And that was one of the most cherished moments for Beth and also for all of us, was to know that she got to say goodbye to her furry family members. The other thing, and I think this is a component of burden that a lot of people talk about, is economic financial issues. A lot of people are incredibly concerned that the costs of their care at the end of life are going to be a burden for their family. And I know that that topic's going to come up a little bit later in how we describe what hospice care can take care of. So I think that might be the last slide on my list. I'm going to ask Felicia, oops, one more. And oh, this is so important. And I know that Robin and Dr. Curran are going to talk about this too. For many people, one of the most important components of a good death was having a care team that they trusted and feeling support from that team. And the doctor's comfort and the nurse's comfort and the whole healthcare team's comfort with the person's wishes about what they wanted their death to look like. And I know we're going to have some conversation about that as the presentation proceeds. So I have a feeling the next slide, I'm going to turn things over to Robin.
Thank you, Carla. So we will go to the next slide after this, and we're going to look at what care team members hospice does provide. So statistics do show that when we have more of our team members supporting patients and caregivers at end of life, we're meeting those spiritual, physical, and psychosocial needs. And we do that through a team of people. So we have our hospice medical doctors, our registered nurses, or case managers who basically drive the care of the team. They're more of the hub of the communication, and they pivot to reach out to the doctor if need, home health aides, social worker, chaplains. We have volunteers, an amazing volunteer group that comes in, massage therapy, music therapy, and our bereavement counseling services. So with COVID, of course, some of our services were pulled out, but we're rebuilding, such as the massage therapy and music therapy, along with the volunteers. But through this group of people, we really support patients at end of life, and of course their caregivers, because the caregivers need education as well on how to take care of their loved one and support too. Next slide, please. So who qualifies for hospice? Any patient may qualify for hospice service if they are expected to live 6 months or less, and that's within the natural disease progression. We do send a nurse out to do an intake, and if qualified, then we bring them on to hospice services. And ideal state is that our patients are referred sooner than later. So, you know, again, you can qualify for hospice about that 6-month time frame. Unfortunately, we do have patients that are referred too late. and they don't get the support they need for their family and themselves. So we're working with the community physicians to really work on getting those referrals sooner, so our patients can take advantage of all the services that we have to offer. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Curran.
Wow, that was quick. Thank you, Robin. Okay, so these next two slides refer to what people often think hospice is. And I hear this so often. Oh, hospice, that means you're going to die. And I say, well, we're all going to die. If we think you may be dying sooner than 6 months from now, then hospice may be able to help you. But it isn't a matter of preparing for death per se. Could we have the next slide? Hospice care, first of all, I love the saying, don't count the days, make the days count. Because we don't have the ability, I don't have a crystal ball. When I certify someone for hospice care, I'm going by predictors, criteria that suggest that in any given disease process, heart disease, lung disease, cancer, or simply dementia, old age, frailty, we have predictors that suggest that someone will not be with us in 6 months. But it's a rough estimate. And we're constantly looking at our patients to see if they still meet those criteria. So we have these predictors that allow us to make an educated guess, but since we don't have a crystal ball, we want people to live as well as they can for as long as they do live. And the way we do that in hospice is with all those team members that Robin just described to you. The social care comes pretty much from everyone, although our social workers do a great deal of it. First of all, it is a holistic approach with all these different team members. Social, emotional, spiritual, and psychological support are provided by all the team members, specifically sometimes by a spiritual counselor or chaplain or a social worker, sometimes often by the nurse case managers, because they are there on a weekly basis, learning to know the families and the patients and supporting them throughout. Community involvement, all our volunteers, our community members, the physician and the physician and the case manager work together on symptom management. The case managers, the nurses, are very, very good at symptom management, and the medical directors, the doctors, get pulled in when things get a little dicey or a little tougher to manage. And we do make regular patient visits as well. Legacy work, sometimes somebody wants to write a memoir. That's going to be really fulfilling for them. I want my granddaughter to know what my life was like in the 1930s. So memoir writing. Sometimes our music therapists are able to create CDs or recordings, or one of our music therapists recently wrote a song that was based on a popular rock song from about 20 years ago, and it was amazing. And he wrote the song specifically for a patient. This is legacy work. It's recorded. The family will have that. Death preparedness, that's an interesting term. It was in this diagram, and I think we're all trying to prepare for death in one way or another. And then, not least, family and caregiver support. And that includes anticipatory guidance when we can identify a family member who is really suffering and grieving before their loved one is gone. We may be able to help them through that process with our bereavement services. So hospice care is living as well as possible for as long as you live. Next slide, please. And just a little Venn diagram, because I like Venn diagrams. I think they make things pretty clear. all hospice is palliative care. Not all palliative care is hospice. Palliative care involves many, if not all, of the same features that we just saw on that previous slide, but delivered to a group of patients or to an individual patient who may just have a serious illness, who may have a potentially life-limiting illness, but not necessarily a 6-month prognosis. But they really are the same thing, just delivered to patient populations that are slightly different from a demographic standpoint. Next slide.
Dr. Kern, as we're waiting before you get into the myths and the facts, someone had asked a question about where hospice services are provided. And specifically, they wondered if they were available in skilled nursing settings.
Yeah, I think that actually comes up in the myths and facts section. So if it's okay, we'll wait and deal with it then. Is that okay? Okay, thanks. So yeah, let's explore some myths and realities. Let's go to the next slide. See what the first myth is. Hospice means you're giving up. And again, one of my favorite quotes, don't count the days, make the days count. And I would, sometimes when patients say to me, oh, sure, you want me to engage hospice, you just want me to give up. And my answer to that is always, I'm not suggesting that you give up on life. I'm suggesting that you give up on treatments that aren't getting you where you want them to go. And then don't give up at all on life. Give up on the things that aren't helping you and really go for the things that are. So next slide. Hospice is a place. Here's the answer to that one. Hospice is wherever our patients are. We have a lot of patients in home hospice, in assisted living, in skilled nursing facilities. As far as having hospice in a hospital, unfortunately, the reality is that with the Medicare structure, we are not able to care for hospice patients in the hospital unless they have symptoms that we've already tried to manage in their ordinary setting, the home, the assisted living, the nursing home, and failed. So if someone has severe pain and we've tried a bunch of different things at home and we just can't get it under control, patients can go to the hospital. Here locally, we have St. Peter's Inpatient Hospice Unit, which is a beautiful half a floor on the 5th floor at St. Peter's with private rooms and quiet and peace and nurses that do nothing but hospice care. So it's really a lovely place to be. Unfortunately, for the most part, the goal is not to pass in the hospital. Now, it sometimes comes to that. The other time we have availability of inpatient hospice care is when families or loved ones, and I agree with Carla, the family incorporates not just biological family, but your family of choice. And so sometimes I just say caregivers. When caregivers just can't do it anymore, we can utilize the hospital inpatient hospice beds for caregiver breakdown. And sometimes that's a transition to a skilled nursing facility, and sometimes it's just a 5-day respite so that people can kind of get their bearings and take a breather. As far as hospice homes are concerned, there was an absolutely beautiful one in San Francisco called the Zen Hospice Project that was started by a very well-known palliative care doctor, B.J. Miller. And places like this are difficult to open and maintain for financial reasons. If they're large enough, they have to meet every single regulatory regulation that a hospital would have to meet, which is very difficult. It's very expensive and time consuming. If they're small enough, then they're pretty much staffed by volunteers because you have no way of funding them. That said, there are a few in this area, and we can, you know, certainly get the names of them to anyone who's interested in a particular place. It's, to me, a wonderful idea that is very difficult to do in our financial climate. So I'm happy to take more questions about that later, but I hope that covers that. Myth, hospice takes away all your medications. No, 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 no. We do not take away all your medications. We work with you, with your primary doctor, and I as the medical director for hospice, to stop, again, giving up medications that aren't getting you where you want to go. One of the things we suggest, for instance, is that people stop taking anti-cholesterol medications, because if your prognosis is short, the time it takes for one of those Lipitor kind of medications to do you any good is way longer than 6 months. So it's just a pill that sometimes hurts your liver, sometimes gives you muscle aches, and that isn't really helping you. We do keep a lot of medications. If your thyroid is low, we keep you on the thyroid medication. If you have congestive heart failure, we keep you on your water pill, because certainly while we aren't seeking to aggressively prolong life, we're certainly not seeking to shorten it either. And not being able to breathe is pretty uncomfortable. I don't want my patients not to be able to breathe. So I will keep them on things like water pills. So it's a case-by-case basis, but we certainly don't take away all medications. Next slide. You have to give up all other medical treatment to have hospice, another myth. It is true that if you come onto hospice with an advanced cancer, you will be stopping aggressive, hopefully life-prolonging treatment. Although by the time people come to hospice, they usually have decided that either the burden of the chemotherapy is too much for them to consider doing it anymore, or it simply won't help anymore. We go on treating most other medical conditions. If you have an advanced cancer and you have emphysema, we'll keep on treating your emphysema. The one thing that sometimes, because chemotherapy even at times in the right circumstance can be kept going. For instance, if you are a woman who has had breast cancer and you are on one of those pills that blocks estrogen and helps keep you from recurring your breast cancer, you may have been on it for 10 or 15 years and you might never have a problem with your breast cancer again. But if you're on hospice for severe emphysema, and that's your life-limiting condition, you can keep on taking your estrogen pills, your anti-estrogen pills, because it's not part of your 6-month prognosis. And that's really what it boils down to. If the medical condition you're treating is not likely to end your life in 6 months, then it's not considered related to the reason you're on hospice. And so we keep treating. Next slide. Hospice, oh, it's one of my favorites. Hospice gives you medications like morphine to speed up your death. We absolutely do not do that. There's something, if we do provide medication to relieve pain and suffering, we give enough to relieve pain and suffering, but not enough to make you stop breathing, which is what morphine does if you give too much of it. So frequently people might be very sleepy, not frequently, sometimes people are very sleepy if that's what it takes to relieve their pain, but they're breathing just fine. So we really are very, very careful. We have a saying in hospice medicine, start low and go slow. So we give small doses at first, and we increase them a little at a time until we get the result we want, which is pain control and breathing control and suffering control. Yeah, so that's just a myth. It's a huge myth. Next one. Hospice is expensive is a myth. Hospice is a Medicare and Medicaid benefit. Once you are on hospice, nothing related to your hospice condition comes out of your pocket. Medicare covers it. Medicare also will likely cover other medical conditions and pay for them separately, just like they would if you weren't on hospice. Most private insurance plans do have a hospice benefit associated with them. Obviously, some people are too young for Medicare when they have, sadly, a life-limiting illness. But patients are never charged for their hospice care. Next slide. You can only have hospice if you have cancer. Not true. It is true that cancer was once the main reason people engaged hospice. However, if you are 99 years old and failing and you've stopped eating and you've lost a lot of weight and perhaps you have Alzheimer's, and we use those things to say you may only have 6 months to live, you are very much a hospice candidate. Things like advanced lung disease, or heart disease, people who have been hospitalized many times and for whom there is no more aggressive treatment that can help their lung or heart condition may wish to stay home. And again, may be hospice eligible. So next slide. You will die sooner if you have hospice. Actually, I can think of half a dozen patients that we have had to discharge alive from hospice because they weren't doing very well when they came on hospice. And with all the additional support that they get or that they have gotten over a 6 or 8 or 10 or 18 month period, have done so well that they really don't meet those criteria anymore for someone who might not live more than 6 months. And I see it happen all the time. And the irony is that usually the families of people who have to be discharged are very sad that they have to go off hospice because the support is so amazing. So it's absolutely not true that you'll die sooner if you have hospice. You will live as long as you were going to live and possibly longer. Next slide. Okay, hospice only takes care of the patient's medical needs. Well, I think we've already seen from what Robin went through and one of my first slides, we try to take care of every aspect of our patients and their caregivers. So next slide. Okay, I think this goes back to Robin.
Thank you, Dr. Curran. So some of our bereavement services after a patient passes are available for group counseling and individual. Coming off the myths and reality, our bereavement services are not just for patients, family members, or caregivers that have passed, but we do accept a lot of community referrals as well. We do a lot of crisis response for schools. We were very involved. Our bereavement supervisor, Sierra, set up the first ever in New York State COVID-19 loss group that was virtual at the time. So we cover a lot of areas with this. So our current, what you're seeing now is a list of our current group and individual counseling areas. So as needs come up and change as well, if there's not a large participation in the group might be shut down, but something else like a COVID group might come up, and then we open up the group for that. So it really is an amazing department that we have here at Community Hospice. We also deal with children. So the Wave Riders is currently on hold because of COVID, but our Camp Erin, which is for children of bereaved children, they did for their second year virtually. And the kids have a blast. So I'm in the hallway with actually all the counselors, and I could hear the week that they were doing the camp, all the kids and their activities that they would do together, and it's just quite amazing. Some of our chaplains even do funerals or the graveside services. So we do quite a bit here in this department. So our services don't end when the patient passes. We're still here for our family members, our caregivers, and our community long after. And it's just such a wonderful thing that we are able to provide for the community and families. The next slide.
Okay, thank you very much. There is one thing I just wanted to mention, just as a little bit of more information about the community hospice, which is what we are part of. We do serve 8 counties. Our average census, meaning the average number of patients we have on hospice at any given time, runs around 550. We have 5 medical directors, 5 full-time medical directors, 4 full-time, including our chief medical officer. And then we have 226 direct patient care team members, which is anyone who interacts with a patient. The nurse case managers, LPNs, home health aides, social workers, volunteers, everybody, direct facing. And then there were a couple of questions. Do you want us to field any of those questions?
Yes, so one of the questions in the chat box is, with the increasing number of older adults in our population, what is hospice doing to increase the number of hospice beds? One of the ways that I responded was that because we're not a place, we're always addressing our staffing needs to meet the census, but I didn't know if there was anything else, Dr. Curran or Robin, that you might want to add to that.
I think I would just say that, you know, as I mentioned before, it's, I'm not aware of any initiative in the community hospice to increase the number of inpatient beds. We do have beds at all the community hospitals in addition to the inpatient unit. As far as increasing the number of home hospices that are not paid for by Medicare, that usually has to be an initiative started by an individual or an organization, philanthropic group or individual, because it's a full-time job in and of itself, just starting and running those. I don't know if that answers your question.
Dr. Curran and Robin, maybe you can address this too, because I know another trend that has happened is more skilled nursing facilities are partnering with hospice programs to provide hospice care in those facilities. Is that one way that this need is being met?
In my experience, the nursing homes that claim to have their own intrinsic hospice units often don't have the staff that are truly trained in palliative care. You can certainly be in a nursing home and be a hospice patient. But that means collaborating with the nursing home, which we do all the time. So I don't know if that answers.
Yeah, and I haven't seen any new contracts come through to add new facilities. I think we have very, very well established rapport with our current facilities across the 8 regions that we do cover. Some of them maybe haven't had a hospice patient in a while, and we do renew those contracts, or it's just working on reestablishing care goals for their patients that then are referred over to hospice. And as far as meeting the care needs, going back to what Kristen had mentioned, we have grown so much, and we are continually identifying areas of improvement to add staff to meet the need of the growth. And we've really, we haven't mentioned our after hours team yet, but over the last few years, I was also directly involved in really getting the after hours team and weekend team to meet a continuum of care. So we have social workers, RNs, chaplains now on the weekends, to where previously we really only had on-call nurses. So that's a wonderful thing. As we've seen our growth, we've added those services as well.
One other question from the chat is that if someone either survives and no longer meets the 6-month criteria, or chooses to revoke their hospice services, which certainly families always have the choice to revoke if they want to seek treatments that maybe weren't available to them previously, can someone then return to hospice at some point?
You bet. You bet. We welcome people back with open arms. We are always sad to see people go, whether they go because they've passed or they go because they revoke. And as long as they meet the 6-month criteria, we're happy to have them back.
Here's another question. Please elaborate. What is community hospice? Is the hospice house at St. Peter's part of community hospice?
Robin, do you want to answer that? I can, or you can.
So the community hospice is under the umbrella of St. Peter's. I'm not sure if they were referring to the hospice inn.
I believe so.
As Dr. Curran had mentioned, yes. So that's a general inpatient or GIP level of care to be at the hospice, and where they have to meet that need. And hopefully Dr. Curran can correct me if I say just the wrong thing, but there has to be an ongoing reason that they're there, because the interventions at home or their nursing home, which we consider home, we were unable to meet the needs of pain control or symptom management. And so that's why they went in to the GIP level of care. So they are under our umbrella and they are part of hospice, but for something like that, it would be more of a temporary situation. I hope I didn't confuse the question at all.
So not another question. Oop, I didn't mean to interrupt somebody.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was a comment that had been made earlier on in the presentation. I just wanted to repeat it to the panel and see if there was any responses in regards to it. Was one of the wonders of the world is that we know that death is inevitable, yet many people believe that they will never die. And I think this is myself an interesting concept, and kind of thinking about this brings up a good conversation, the good talk about a good death. So I just wanted to open that up to see if there are any responses in regards to that.
Well, I'll make a comment to that, because I mentioned earlier I teach a death and dying class at Siena. So the average age of my students in that class is 20 years old. And one of the things that we do very early in the class is I ask them the same question that we posed in the chat box is have you ever heard of the concept of a good death? And what does that mean to you? And then I follow it up with, all right, at what point in your life do you think you need to start having conversations about your views of a good death with the people who need to know what your wishes are? And I get all kinds of fascinating answers to that. And then I follow it up though with a link to a website that illustrates causes of death across the lifespan. And one of the things that they are kind of shocked to see, because today we've talked about deaths that usually are precipitated by illness, right? And a life-limiting illness. But the causes of death for my students, the average age of them being, below 25, is accidental death, homicide, and suicide, all of which are typically sudden and happen at an age when people have that kind of invincibility, right? So we talk a little bit about, all right, when is it time to start having these conversations? And some of them say, well, if accidental deaths, car accidents, maybe when you get your driver's license, you should start having these conversations about what you want if something happens that you can't communicate your wishes. Because my honest belief is that as soon as you're old enough to know what an advance directive is, that you should fill one out, because some of us aren't going to make it to an old age, right? Because we're going to have things happen to us earlier than we would like. And so that whole issue of how do you have conversations about your wishes about the end of life when you don't need to? Because then that gives you the chance to say, well, if I have a life-limiting illness, I might want hospice to be involved instead of treating the illness until I'm so debilitated I can't enjoy my quality of life. So I guess this is where, based on your own comfort levels and your own opinions and attitudes about this, I would challenge everyone to kind of think about when is the right time in your life to do that advanced planning at a time when you don't need it. Because then people's emotions are in a different place, your ability to research and learn is at a different place. And I'm just an honest proponent and advocate of talking about this when you don't need to. So I don't know if that relates to the comment or not, but I'll just share my very opinionated philosophy about that based on having worked with a lot of people who didn't follow that advice. And it created a lot of undue stress at a time when their energy could have been spent focusing on the time you have left, as Dr. Curran so eloquently stated.
And just to add to that, when people are younger or not ill in any way, they say, well, I don't know how I'm going to feel then. And my answer to that is always, you know how you feel now, and this is not set in stone. It's what constitutes good quality of life for you can change over the years, and probably will change for you. And the sooner you start exploring and introspecting and thinking about it, the more comfortable you'll be when it's crunch time.
Well, and the other thing that's changing in our world is that now there are all these amazing and fascinating ways to explore your thoughts and wishes. So for example, one of the links in the presentation, number 3, is called Death Over Dinner. And there was an academic who created this model. I've got the book sitting right over here. Actually, it's a fascinating book where you have a dinner party and you invite people to come, and the goal is to have conversations about their thoughts about the end of life. And absolutely no one sitting at the table is ill or dealing with it at that moment. It's just creating an opportunity to talk. And there's a wonderful project called the Conversation Project. If you're thinking I would have no idea how to start a conversation like this, they have these wonderful manuals and handbooks and worksheets that give you actually what to say to start the conversation and how to reassure the people you want to have the conversation with that you're not secretly dying and just not telling them, because that's the other part that's so hard, is helping other people in your life to be comfortable having those conversations. And so a lot of people have done amazing work and created amazing resources to help you accomplish that goal. Death cafes are also kind of fun. I don't know if you've ever heard of those, but they're informal gatherings where you just talk about anything related to death that's on people's minds. And I have been a co-facilitator of those in the Capital Region for the last couple of years. Death Cafe Albany is a website, or actually a Facebook page, where we publicize when those conversations are going to happen. And they happened pre-pandemic at public libraries, at, let's see, we had one or two at the chapel at Albany Rural Cemetery. We had one at Vale Cemetery, and now we're doing them virtually. So the pandemic hasn't slowed us down. We just took it to another venue. So there are all kinds of amazing opportunities to talk about and explore this at a time you don't need to.
One quick comment in the chat was that if someone doesn't qualify for hospice services, what other options, perhaps qualifying for a palliative care option, might be available to patients or families as an option pre-hospice?
That's a great question. And there's a pretty big push in this country among palliative care physicians and nurse practitioners and PAs, nurses, and social workers, you know, the whole gamut, to develop larger community palliative care programs. They are becoming more available across the country. Unfortunately, right now, there isn't a lot of availability of community palliative care. The Eddy Visiting Nurses do have a palliative care service. Unfortunately, it has to be linked to a skilled nursing need. And once that skilled nursing need is no longer there, they can't continue to provide just the community palliative care, which is too bad. But we're moving in the right direction in this country. We're going there. If anybody else has thoughts about that, please jump in.
When we don't take patients under our care, there is a referral process to make sure that they are still getting some kind of services that they may need, such as palliative care or the Eddy Visiting Nurses. So just because someone doesn't, again, qualify or come on to our services, we don't want to just leave them empty-handed, so to speak, out in the community.
Another question came into the chat box. What if someone is in such grave pain and they're looking for some kind of medical help in dying?
I saw that one. Carla, do you want to start?
Well, that's an incredibly challenging and complicated issue, right? Because the definition of a good death included ethical issues, and this is a huge ethical issue, right? Because I know in my class, for example, one of the things that we talk about is medical aid in dying and the whole history of that very challenging and complicated issue in our country. And part of that depends on where a person lives, because the Supreme Court ruled years ago that it was not a constitutional right to be able to request medical aid in dying. It was being left up to individual states to legislate that. So if you live in New York, unfortunately, if that's a choice you wish you had legal access to, we don't, because it is not legal in the state of New York. There is an organization called Compassion and Choices that is actively working to lobby for that right in New York State, but so far they have not been successful in getting the legislation to a point where it goes to a vote. And I know as a former hospice social worker, this is a challenging topic for hospice, because making that request is kind of counter to the whole philosophy of hospice care, that we can achieve that and create quality of life to the end of life. And again, this is an issue that's very subjective. Some people have many strong, very strong feelings that should be a right. And I have absolutely no right to say that that's a wrong way to feel. It just has created challenges for hospice as a model of care because it contradicts what the goal of that care is. So this is where Dr. Curran, I would really encourage you to kind of jump in and supplement what I've said, because I think that's the best way I can express the dilemma that this creates for hospice.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that what you said is, I would concur with all of it. And then simply add that the research has shown that frequently people who are in intractable pain are asking for medical aid in dying, or they may be asking for medical aid in dying. You mentioned intractable pain. There are other reasons why people request medical aid in dying. Some people feel that they don't want the kind of indignity that comes with losing control of various bodily functions. It may be you're having too much trouble breathing and not pain. There are so many reasons why people do request it, but the studies show that if the symptom that's making the person want to end his or her life intentionally is well managed, the desire for hastening death frequently goes away. So I think it's really on us as hospice providers to make sure that we have done absolutely everything to manage every symptom. And as Carla said, it's not something we can do in this state anyway. It's also true that in states where it is legal, the overwhelming majority of people who make the cut and have two physicians agree that it's acceptable and that they've thought it through and that they're not actively suicidal per se, meaning it's not that they don't want to go on living, it's they don't want to go on living the way they're living. And all the things that you need to do to be certified for this in states where it is legal, the overwhelming majority never take the medicines. So I think that speaks to
I think it's less than 10%.
Yeah, it's very small. And again, sometimes it's just a matter of having the control. And once you have that control, which has been wrested from you by virtue of your terminal illness, once you've got it back, maybe your quality of life isn't so bad as it felt like it was. That's the only thing I can think of and that is what people say when they're asked why they're not taking the medicines they've been given. So yeah, it is an ethical dilemma because, you know, we are charged with first doing no harm. And then the flip side of that is not doing anything that isn't helpful. So we're supposed to be helping people and not doing harm.
And a lot of people will say that people who request that are often victims of inadequate medical care. They haven't had access to professionals who are trained in pain control. And I think that's one of the things that hospice does so well is that they have so much experience with helping people to manage pain. And palliative care programs are also designed to help with pain control. So I think that's really important, that if someone's expressing that desire, to make sure that they've had access to qualified people who have experience with managing difficult pain.
Mm-hmm.
I will add that we do, in my opinion, an excellent job of pain management overall. And that's even for the long-term opioid users, oncology patients. And again, we cover everybody under hospice. So even the drug abusers who it might take a lot more medication to get them comfortable than someone else. And we meet them where they're at and make sure that, and that goes with the dignity and respect as well, no matter where they came from or what their background is, that we're still going to help them have a good death, manage their pain, and honor them with what their desire is.
So thank you so much, panel. As we come to the approaching half hour and the end of our series, I want to thank all of our participants for joining us, and especially for our panelists for presenting some really thoughtful information for all of us to consider. One of our participants put into the chat that, you know, all of these things that we've discussed about today, we don't just wait for death to be knocking at our door, but we think about and talk about and experience all of these things as we go about our living. And so I think that segues well into you know, the philosophy of the community hospice, which is to celebrate life for as long as possible until a person's natural death, and to help their story to be heard and to honor them and to appreciate the life that they have lived, no matter their circumstances, background, whatever they might be, but for them to know that they're valued and appreciated and honored. And again, the team offering that support to the patient and the family. So thank you so much. Thank you for your contributions. Thank you for our participants. This has been a wonderful series, and we would again encourage everyone to visit the LifePath website for the posting of all of the 5 topics that have been taking us on this journey through life and love, from grief to a good death. And so thanks everybody. Have a great rest of the year and holiday season. And we're glad that you could have joined us today. Thank you.